The theater critic. Those two words in themselves conjure up visions of discomfort in the eyes and the id of theater producers. Why? Because they are the people that can make an audience run to the box office or run away from a box office. And today we will see who they are, what they are, and how they function. They can be excoriated or embraced. They can be vilified and applauded. And sometimes we wonder, are they monsters or mentors, or both? And today we will try to show you what a theater critic does. And we're fortunate indeed to have with us a professional theater critic, Tony Del Valle, who is the leading theater critic for the biggest newspaper in the state of Nevada, the Las Vegas Review-Journal. And Mr. Del Valle was an actor, and he was a writer, and he worked for Stars and Stripes when he was in the Army, reviewing shows all over Europe, showing different facets of all kinds of shows. Consequently, he's a man well-versed to do his job. And we will try to find out what a theater critic functions and what he does. My name is Mike Merrick, and I'm a theater producer. And today we will get into the intricacies of theater criticism on this facet of producing for the theater. I'm pleased today to have as our co-host a gentleman who's been with us before, Mr. Nate Bynum, who is not only a professor of theater at the university, but also teaches a class in acting techniques and many other things. And he really understands the theater very well. And Nate, thank you very, very much for joining us and for being here.
Thank you.
It's
always good to be here.
And of course, the gentleman that I spoke with you about earlier, Mr. Tony Del Valle, is sitting right here. And Tony, thank you very much for joining us and giving us the inside views of what a critic really should be, could be, would be, and hopefully may be.
Tony, let me welcome you to the show.
Thanks.
I'd like to start off because it's a semantics thing, I know, but sometimes we use the terms critic and review, and we use them interchangeably. So you're a theater critic, correct? And would you say that a reviewer is something different, or do you use them interchangeably as well?
I think most people today use them interchangeably. I guess I think of a critic more as a specialist, an expert who is giving his opinion regardless of what anyone else may think, and he has a background in the area.
More studied, more learned, educated in that sense.
I think so. If we're going to go with those two terms, the reviewer is more of a journalist, I think, who is reporting on the event that occurred last night and perhaps giving his opinion, but perhaps he's a little bit more aware of how other people are responding to the work. The problem today, I think, is that most publications, once you get outside the big theater towns, are not giving a lot of space to theater reviews. And in order to be a real critic, I think you have to have space. You have to be able to define your arguments and argue them, and it's hard to do that when you don't have the space to do it.
Who receives the most criticism then? A person doing the review or a person giving a critique? Who has the most fans in the long run?
I think critics, there's no rules when it comes to critiquing critics. I get mail that says, your mother must have not hugged you enough, and you need therapy and all that.
I heard that.
I've never read a review where a critic said that about an actor, that he needed therapy, although God knows I've had my suspicions.
No, if I may interject, I don't think that's necessarily true, because there have been a number of critics who shall be nameless for the moment who have not only said actors need therapy, but they have criticized actors for the way they look.
Well, the first one I don't agree with. The second one I do. I've never. If you could give me the name of a critic and the title of his review,
I didn't prepare myself.
I'll bet there's never been a critic that has written that an actor needed therapy.
Maybe
but people say that about critics all the time. And as far as criticizing how an actor looks are part of an actor's job. If he's playing Romeo, he better not look like me. Now I could play Falstaff, I'd be fine for that physically, but the way you look is part of your job as an actor.
You're quite right in that specific area. However, and I think Nate, I hope, will agree with me, there are a number of critics who shall be nameless who, let's say, they look at an actress and say, I don't like her legs, which
John
has
Simon.
nothing. My God, how did you guess?
Just
Boy,
a
you
wild
came
guess.
out of that out of left field.
Yeah, and the
John
indication
Simon,
is, the
always.
suggestion is that that person physically isn't right for the role, so the director made a bad choice in casting.
Right.
And the critic feels that then it's fair game based on the way the actress looks.
And I think, if I may, about John Simon, I think he could argue whether or not he goes too far. But his point, he's given rave reviews to many women who are not technically beautiful, but he feels in certain kinds of roles there has to be a radiance about you or some sort of physicality. And he argues that talent can transform a mediocre-looking woman into a beautiful woman. He mentions the young Maggie Smith, not technically beautiful. But he argues that certain kinds of women physically are disturbing to look at, and that takes away from
I don't want to
the
get
art.
into a John Simon dissertation today because we can go on with that
Sure.
in itself. But the other thing is, but you and Nate started to talk about something that I'd like you to expand on, and that is the background. He was talking quite correctly. I think it's an intelligent approach. The reviewer and the critic. The reviewer lists who's in it, what's doing, and the critic says maybe they should have done this or maybe should have done that. My question is, do you think that there is a specific aspect of educational quality necessary to become a theater critic?
Yeah, it's a tough question because there are examples that will violate whatever formula you come up with.
Yeah.
But I would say in general, I think there's three basic things a critic should know. One, he needs an extensive background in whatever art he's critiquing. If he's going to critique theater, he ought to know a lot about theater in whatever way. It could be self-education, whatever. I'm not necessarily impressed with degrees because you can self-educate yourself. I think he needs to be a good writer. Most of the critics I know in newspapers have a love of writing. They sometimes are just as well versed in literature as they are in theater. And then the third thing is I think you need to know a little something about life. You need to have some life experiences. It's one thing to read about love and disappointment, and it's another thing to experience it.
It's a very good point. Very good point.
That's why I think, and I'm a little bit prejudiced, but I think most good critics, you hit your stride when you're in your 40s. I think it's tough to be 21 and be a brilliant critic. And
well, you
there are
haven't had that much
exceptions.
experience. You know, you see, Nate, you were saying?
Do critics have a long life then? I think I read somewhere in researching for this particular interview that there comes a time when a critic may have bypassed the time when they're really valuable and insightful and can elucidate on theater, the contemporary theater.
I think if you handle your age right, which means you don't get crusty and set in your ways, you don't feel like anything new is terrible. I think your knowledge, the older you get, the more knowledgeable you are, and I would think that would benefit you. I mean, I love critics who can talk about the theater of the 50s and the 40s, and you can't be 21 and do that, although certainly you can read about it. But I mean, if I was alive in Shakespeare's time, I think I'd be a better critic today as a result of all that experience. But you have to be careful. There is a tendency to hate anything that's new,
That's unfortunate if it's true, and in some instances it is true, you see. In keeping with that, let me ask you a specific question. Do you think that there's a wide range of difference between the critics today of 2006 and the critics such as Brooks Atkinson, Walter Kerr, George G. Nathan, the guys from 40 years ago, who really were students of the theater? And you said something very good before, Tony. You said they have to really love the theater, and I think you're right about that.
Yeah. I don't think there is a difference because the names you mentioned, along with George Bernard Shaw, are the names that I think any decent critic will have studied and been brought up on. I mean, I was brought up on those men, and I'm sure that, I imitated them a lot as I was learning, along with Pauline Kael, who used to be the film critic for The New Yorker.
And a darn good one.
Yeah. Her style influenced, many of us who are my age. But I think those are the giants, and I think anyone who knows anything about criticism will know those names and will have studied them. But I think even back in their day, in the 40s and 30s, once you get out of the big cities, there are a lot of people working as critics who, I'll be frank, have no business working as critics, simply because a lot of times it's a reward. An editor will say, "You've done such a good job on the police beat. I'm going to let you review plays," and it's just considered a treat.
And that's when a critic just becomes a writer, a person who can put pen to paper, correct, and fill up a column.
But he calls himself a critic, and people look at him as a critic. And
I had a personal unfortunate experience right within that category. A number of years ago, I did a play on Broadway. I'm not going to name that because then we'll find out who the guy is. They had a temporary critic before Frank Rich, who was, on my view, who did some harm and a lot of good.
Right?
Well, they had Clive Barnes, but between Clive Barnes and Frank Rich, don't figure it out. They had a guy who came from the travel section.
Oh, yeah.
And he wrote the criticism for less than a year. My luck, I got him. And I needed a friend to help me interpret what he said. I said, did he like it? I'm not sure. It shouldn't be that way. Even if it's sharp, even if it's negative, there's got to be reasons. I think you might agree with that.
A lot of editors don't have respect for what criticism is all about. I think good criticism is an art, just like writing plays is an art.
I agree.
But the critic has to be well trained. That doesn't mean the critic's right. I'm not saying that, but he's got to have a background.
I like what you said about it being an art because I do think it is. I mean, if you talk about the people, if you think about the people you just mentioned, the Walter Kerrs and the Dorothy Parkers and the Frank Rich and all those people, there was a sense of personality they had, and you knew their personality. It always came out in the way they wrote or how they critiqued a particular show. Does that come with the fact that they're trained and they've accustomed to putting themselves into a review or critique? Is that a part of the training that makes them different from others?
I look at myself and I know that ever since I was a kid I went to theater, and if you go to a lot of theater, just as if you go to a lot of movies, you tend to form opinions, and your opinions are really a projection of yourself. The critic reveals a lot about himself by his reviews, which he might not even intend to do.
Which becomes their style, their personality.
Yeah.
Right.
And then in journalism, probably if you're a professional critic, hopefully you've read a lot of critics, and you know that projecting your style, projecting your personality is a part of what the job is about, which is why I hate it when critics are accused of not being objective, because there's nothing objective about a review. We bring who we are to what we do, all our prejudices, all our life experiences. It influences our taste in plays, which is why two brilliant critics may consistently disagree with one another. That doesn't make them less brilliant, but their life experiences are shaping their opinion.
I applaud you for that statement. That's very revealing. Let me ask you something with regard to that aspect of it. When you're reviewing, when I say you, I'm talking about the broad you, the critics, are reviewing a revival as opposed to a new play. Do you think it's proper for a critic to say, I'm reviewing this revival, and when I saw the original 10 years ago, they were much better than this one, or they were different, and I liked them better, and etc. Naturally, you can tell by my tone that I don't approve of it, but I want to know how you feel about it.
Revivals. I can tell that too.
You're darn right I have, yes.
Well, we should name that critic too as a person.
But I know, when I produced revivals, I was very fortunate. Frank Rich wrote a love letter for Richard Burton in Camelot, and I didn't produce that many revivals, but boy, that was a biggie because of him. Because he was a great actor and a great personality, and God rest his soul, he was a wonderful man.
Yeah, good.
But when they compare, I'm not talking about big stars. When they say, this actor, he's very good, but when I saw it originally 12 years ago, I saw another actor, and he had a whole different, I liked him better. What is your feeling about that?
I think it can be legitimate to compare, it can be, but the thrust of the review has to be what is before the critic. And the problem with sometimes comparing an older actor or another actor or another production is that you have to judge the show based on its own merits. Richard Burton in Camelot may not be Richard Harris in Camelot, but it's very dangerous to say, well, one was better than the other.
Exactly.
Let's see the role through Richard Harris's eyes. But I might say, it might be legitimate to say Richard Burton achieved a very important effect which Richard Harris is incapable of achieving, or vice versa.
Well, I produced both of those plays with them, and I lived through it. I'm still here.
What is the function of a critic?
Truth is, I don't know. I'm always thinking about that, but I think the function of the drama critic is to shed some insights into a production for the reader. I think the key word there is for the reader. He's not there for the theater person. He's there for the person reading his column. He's not a director giving notes. He's not there to be supportive of the actor. He's there to be supportive of the reader.
Very good point.
There's a big deal. People are sometimes saying, why can't you be constructive? But I think, for instance, if I said in a review, Raquel Welch has no business being on any stage, anywhere, I'm not being constructive towards Raquel Welch, but I'm being constructive, I think, towards the art of theater. And that's where my loyalties lie, towards the reader and theater as a whole, not necessarily towards your production or your actors.
That's interesting, because in that definition and in that example, what you are protecting, based on what you said, is the American theater or the live theater, though it may be destructive to the person in that particular production. Would you agree?
Exactly.
But
exactly.
That's not your concern, you're saying?
Yeah, it can't be. It can't be. Because, you know, the most constructive thing in some communities may be to burn all the local theaters down and start over. It may be that it's so horrible that we just need to start over. That's not true in Vegas, I don't think. But so my concern is with the quality of theater and making recommendations to the readers. I don't want to tell the reader something's a great show, and then he goes and sees the show and he hates it and he says, well, I guess I don't like theater. You know, I love the idea that I give it a bad review and I'd still like him to go. But I want him to know that I understand when he says he didn't like it. There may be good reasons why he didn't like it.
On that, I want to ask you a question, because that to me is constructive criticism, which I think any intelligent and open-minded producer has to understand and appreciate. Because I think it is a function of a critic to say, I think the music in that musical was bad because. I think the book was weak because. And you read it and you say, you know something? Especially out of town, before you get to the big Broadway. If you read something like that, a critic can be very, very helpful.
Sure.
Moving Out, which Twila Tharp directed, was the best example of that. It got killed in Chicago, and she listened, and she followed the guidelines of the critics, and they came into New York, and it was like practically a different show.
And I don't meet very many humble people like that. Humble in the sense that she realized that there were mistakes and she had to correct them, and she did, and she wound up having a hit show as a result.
Absolutely.
But not necessarily that the critic is always right. I don't mean that at all. But
Thank
certainly,
you for saying that.
if you're the one thing I do regret, I wish every town had like 5 daily papers, and every show got like 5 reviews, because you know that those 5 people are very rarely all going to all agree with each other. And then the producer can say, well, this makes sense, this doesn't, you know, and then they can pick. But right now, sometimes when you have only one major paper, it comes out like this is, you know, the Bible. And
does that make your job more difficult? Because I was thinking about that as well. But you are, in my opinion, the most insightful, analytical critic that we have. But because there aren't others who may give differing opinions in newspapers that we can see every day, you do become the voice.
Yeah.
So does it put more pressure on you then
it does,
to get it right?
When I used to work for a weekly here in town, where my reviews,
the City Life Weekly,
my reviews were not that visible to the average person. And the nice thing about that was I felt I could go on a rant and say whatever I had to say without worrying about box office. And, you know, of course I do worry about box office. I don't want theater to die in this town. And now I hate the fact that maybe I'm embarrassing people because their parents are reading a review, or I hate the fact that
you can't get involved with that. You're right.
You have to just shut your eyes to it. And I hate the fact that I might be hurting box office. I think the goal I have is to learn how to write a negative review and interest the reader, you know?
That is see, how to write a negative review and interest the reader. I love that phrase, because you're not saying it stinks, don't go. Let me give you a personal experience. I think I mentioned it to you, Nate. I did a musical in New York. Don't ask me what and don't ask me when, okay? And the critic, who has a right to say, he said, and I quote, I remember this word for word, I am not paraphrasing. Don't go. Stay home.
Yeah.
Read a good book. And I was absolutely beside myself. I met with the editors. Of course, it didn't do me any good, let's be honest about it. But I think that's inexcusable. Say I hated it, okay. Don't go. What kind of a nonsensical, asinine, ridiculous, anti-theatrical remark is that?
Of course, he could argue that I want to urge people to go to good theater, and the way for me to do that is to really bash bad theater. He could argue that.
Sure bashed it.
But
That's a
bash.
broad stroke of power and influence, though, Tony. You're defending it well, but isn't that a broad stroke of power and influence to say, I can be as critical as I want, as brutal as I want, and I'm doing it for the good of theater, in my opinion?
is it broad? Is that what you're asking me?
Yeah, well,
I guess, what I'm trying to point out is, people always talk about the media as if it's one entity. Drama critics, every drama critic you get in this chair is going to have a different opinion.
Sure.
And I'm just sharing with you my viewpoint. And but I also see that there's other approaches towards criticism that might be very valid. I guess in Vegas, I feel that we have so little theater that what I would really like to do is help encourage people to go to any of it and still be honest with my opinion. I don't want to say something is good when I don't think it's good. And I think what I'm trying to sell is passion. Like I want the reader to say, I want to get in on this argument. If I say that this is the worst play I've seen in 30 years, I would love for the reader to say, hey, I got to go see this and, and see if this jerk is really right or what's going on. So I would never write that, but I could see the justification.
But Las Vegas is not, I don't care what said. A few months ago, it was said that Las Vegas is the new Broadway.
Yeah.
That's nonsense.
Yeah.
Because if you have Broadway, you're smiling, Nate. Because there has to be a balance. You can't do all musicals. Would Doubt go in this town? Would Proof go in this town? I'm talking about heavy drama. Would the Lieutenant of Inishmore go in this town? Of course not. What goes in this town, sometimes musicals don't even go in this town. I applaud the fact that Las Vegas, that the owners of various and sundry venues have the courage and the guts to do theater. I love the fact that Phantom of the Opera is here. I love the fact that the Producers is coming here. But let's take a look at the common denominator. They're musicals.
Sure.
Phantom isn't a comedy, but boy, is it spectacular.
and that's why I was smiling, because you and I agree on that. We've had this discussion before. I don't think Las Vegas is a place for traditional as a theater. And you and I were having a discussion before where you want to see more of it.
Well, what I'm hoping is that there may come a time, forget gambling for a second, because Las Vegas could attract more than one type of tourist. Sure. That there may come a time when there's enough theater here where someone in LA or the state of Washington might think to themselves, I can't afford to go to New York, I don't have the time to go to New York, but I can go to Vegas on a 1-hour flight and see maybe 5 musicals. And maybe they won't even do any gambling, but they'll come here and see 5 or 6 shows. We have the potential for that.
It would be wonderful if it could happen.
I don't know if it can happen. I have no idea. I don't think it's dead, though.
No, I don't think so either.
It's a little too early to calling it dead.
Who knows? Let me ask you a question, among many others. What makes a show critic proof? Is there such a thing?
If I knew the answer to that, I'd be a producer, Mike. And I'd be the
I'm a producer and I don't know the answer to that.
I'd be the most successful one in the history.
Let's remember something. Les Miserables, which has been running and reopening again for 15 or more years, etc., was not destroyed, but it got very lukewarm, tepid reviews.
And so
from
did
the
Phantom of
critics.
the Opera, the #1 show in the
right.
history of Broadway.
Okay.
Cats, the #2 show in the history
Right.
of Broadway. All got
And
bad
My
reviews.
Fair Lady, which is
got
still
good
held.
reviews?
No, it didn't.
Oh, yes, it
When
did,
it opened in New Haven, just a minute.
Oh, New Haven. No, that's
When
different.
it opened in New Haven, before it came to New York, it got great reviews in New York. You're right.
Okay.
But outside of town, I mean, they just absolutely practically
Because they
destroyed
worked on it and listened to the critics.
Okay, that's where. See, he got me with that one.
No, but
He's got me with that one.
William Goldman, in his book Adventures in the Screen Trade, says something very profound. Nobody knows anything. After a show opens and it flops, everybody knows why.
You're right.
If it succeeds, everybody knows why.
Boy, is he right. I read that book. It's a Bible.
Yes.
I've shortened the phrase to nobody knows.
Nobody knows. But don't you agree? Because you guess.
Absolutely.
As a producer, you guess. That's all.
Absolutely.
And then when it flops
you
or
try
succeeds,
to evaluate, but you have to let the creative people do their thing.
Yeah. Who knows why Mamma Mia, what's it, its 3rd or 4th year?
Yeah.
Nobody predicted that kind of success.
Well, the songs, are you ready? I want to show you how clever I am. I think the music is brilliant. I love ABBA. I first saw it in England. I'm ashamed to say this, but I'm going to tell you. I walked out during the interval because I hated the contrived, hokey book. It should only happen to me. It's a wonderful show that is a franchise. So in other words, nobody knows, especially me. What do I know?
walked out on a preview of Cats, and I thought, in New York. I walked out after about 45 minutes, and I thought this show is,
I
no
didn't
doubt-
like it when I first saw it in
I
England.
thought no doubt it's going to flop.
Oh, yeah.
I was
See,
wrong on that.
well, we're both wrong. I agree with you. I didn't walk out on it, but I didn't like it. So you don't know. I want Nate to
Tony,
get him.
you do a lot of reviewing or critiquing, if we will, of academic theater. And you go from UNLV, where of course I happen to work, to CCSN and some of the other, I guess they'd be called regional theaters by their own definition here. Is there a different way when you critique these shows versus UNLV versus the community college versus, say, some of the high school productions that you may do as well?
Well, I hope it's understood by the reader that you have different standards for different types of theater. If you're reviewing a Broadway show, you don't review that the same way you would review an amateur children's theater
So
company.
you expect more out of one versus the other?
Or less, yeah. No, I mean, like UNLV now has the Nevada Conservatory Theater. They bring in equity stars. They recruit from out of town. And these are people who are hoping to have a professional career in theater. So you certainly review that with a different attitude than you would a community theater made up of, people who are just rehearsing a couple hours a night and have a day job and that sort of thing, And I can't keep saying that in every review. You have to just hope the reader understands
Right.
that every
You're
show
quite
has
right.
its own standard,
right. What do you think of shows that come on, whether it be, mostly Broadway lately, that have just big stars in there, and the show in itself is kind of soft or weak,
And they are the draw if there's going to be a
They
draw.
are the draw, and,
Well, Julia Roberts, for example,
Right.
and I got to give her a lot of credit.
Sure.
I mean, she deserves a lot of applause to have the guts. This woman, who is probably the leading movie star today with the kind of money she makes, and she does a wonderful job on the screen, to have the guts and the desire, and you used the word passion before, to go on that stage 8 times a week.
Yes.
I don't care what she did. Boy, oh boy, she's bravo,
And
Julia
in
Roberts.
LA, what's exciting to me, you find a lot of times theaters in the middle of nowhere, in the basement, there'll be an unadvertised big star, let's say from TV, who's on hiatus, and she's doing a play. I once saw B. Arthur do Mother Courage.
Yeah.
Wasn't advertised. I had no idea I was about to see her, but she loves theater so much that,
wonderful, isn't it, when they
she'll
do
do a
that?
99-seat theater show because she loves it. But I regret that about New York. I mean, first off, I'm just glad theater is alive and doing well. I mean, Broadway's had one of its best seasons ever. There is a Hollywoodization going on now where a lot of times you just get the big Hollywood star, you have no care about whether or not that star fits the role, and then they sell out and
I'll tell you, they've done a wonderful thing with Chicago. The Weislers, who produced the revival of Chicago, which is going to have its 10th anniversary. I mean, with them, people may think it's hokey. Well, I have to applaud them for it, because they've kept that show alive. They've kept people working. They've brought in the audience. Promotional or not, hokey or not, whatever it might be, Usher is in it now. Now, when this is seen, maybe he'll be out of it. He's in it for 6 weeks. But they've had a series of pretty well-known names, whether it be the music industry or otherwise, playing Billy Flynn. I think that's wonderful. It enhances the production. It gives work to a lot of actors,
So
a
you
lot of
like the
musicians.
introduction of stars into plays?
Well,
Whether
into that, as far as keeping it going and keeping people working, from that point of view, I think it's important.
And, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to imply that there's anything wrong with having Hollywood stars go to
No, I
Broadway,
understand.
but some of them don't even know how to project.
No,
they've
that's
never
true.
worked
No, you're
in the
right.
theater.
I'm not talking about
Well,
that.
it's probably a lifelong dream of theirs to be on stage, and now the name and the recognition gives them an opportunity to do it, and so they're on stage perhaps the first time. I question sometimes whether it's the right venue for them, such a large venue, say Broadway for the first time for an actor who's never done stage.
Who's never done stage.
Who's never
Well,
done
that's
stage.
true.
Yes.
Why do they have to be the star if they've never done stage? Why can't
Let
they
'em- that's a good
respect the
question.
craft and
You
take
know
a good
why?
supporting role?
Because the producers, you should forgive the
Trying to
expression,
make-
it
exactly.
picks up the box
Financial-
office.
And I got to say something about producers.
Please do.
I do not blame them at all for doing things like that, in the sense that the producer is the one that's losing his shirt 9 times out of 10. It's not my money up there; it's
Yeah,
the
yeah, yeah.
producers. So just like these premium seats, these
Oh, I
tickets.
hate that.
But there's a lot of scalpers out there who are making maybe $1,000 a seat for the latest hit.
So in other words, let them do it for the show.
Let the producer make
understand.
that money, but just don't have too many of them. But I mean, let the producer, get in on that instead of the scalpers. And think of that the last 9 shows that producer did may have flopped. So he's finally, making a buck. Why not?
Can I get back to the academic theater just for a little while? If you're critiquing a play at a university, and of course there's mainly student actors, do you feel a special responsibility to elucidate what they've done or the value of their work, or perhaps not even the value of their work, but how they performed?
No.
It's all the same. Professional.
Well, no. I don't mean it's the same. I just mean it's not the same, as I said before, that if I'm reviewing a touring show and it's all made up of equity actors, that's a different standard than UNLV. What I don't feel an obligation to be constructive to the student. I may even say, I did say this once, this playwright has no business in the playwriting program. Mm-hmm. And that's a tough criticism, but I mean, the play was so pedestrian that, and this was a final year MFA student, that I thought it was inexcusable. And I have an MFA in playwriting, so I know, I have a pretty good idea of expectations, I think, for where a student ought to be. It's like a person's getting an MFA in voice, he's in the third year and he can't carry a tune, somebody's got to tell him.
You get an MFA in voice? I didn't know. An MFA in voice?
No, I'm just using that as an example.
Get an MFA in haberdashery.
What about original work? Same thing?
Well, I mean, you're aware they're students. You can't, you're not judging the same way you would a Tennessee Williams play. Mm-hmm. You're aware they're students, and you judge them according to whatever they may happen to be. Third-year MFA student, I would think they need to know something about structure. I expect it to be very rough, but I'm looking to see some sparks of talent. And as a matter of fact, if there's one area that he's totally deficient in, I may almost ignore that. I might mention it in one line, but if he's just brilliant with characters, then you want to deal with that a lot. Sure. But if he was Tennessee Williams, you might deal with the deficiencies more, because he's in a place where that's okay. Well, he's dead, but I mean, you know what I'm saying. Yeah. Professionally, he's in a place where it's okay.
You and I were talking off camera about the number of plays that you see during the week. So let's help our listeners here see what kind of workload you have, understand what kind of workload you have during the week.
Well, it almost...
And they may be more apologetic now after reading some of your reviews because they know you're seeing 3 or 4 plays a week.
Yeah, the theater in Vegas just about entirely shuts down in the summer, and in December. So that means during the year, I see anywhere from 1 to 6 plays a week, and then my deadline is Monday morning. So a lot of times I'm very bleary-eyed Sunday night writing a bunch of reviews, and a lot of times people will write to me and say, "You idiot, you spelled my name wrong." And I'm thinking, I'm just grateful I got the title of the playwright because I was so tired when I was writing all of it. So it gets to be a heavy workload, and that's why when people say critics just love to tear people down, you see so many plays and so many bad plays that you always pray to God when you go see a show that this is going to be a good one.
Yeah.
What makes you decide what play you're going to see or not see? Because you can't see them all, I'm guessing.
In Vegas, I do get to see just about all of them. It's just instinct. What I think I always think what's going to be the most interesting play to my readers. And there's no hard and fast rule. Or sometimes, if I was forced to miss one theater's play last time, I'll try to go to that one.
But pretty much you can't get to them all. There's enough.
Yeah, pretty much. There's a couple of exceptions, but pretty much.
In keeping with that, what do you think of the practice that's become terribly popular in New York of, the old story about the critic gets up when the curtain goes down and runs up the aisle to write the review? Well, now they go see previews.
I'm so glad because, there's that famous story, 2, in Gypsy. I forgot the name of the critic, but it ends with a beautiful number, Rose's Turn.
Yeah.
If you don't watch that number, I don't think you know the show. And the critic was getting up to leave right as that number was beginning, and David Merrick blocked him and refused to let him leave. And A Streetcar Named Desire, Brooks Atkinson was getting ready to leave right before the last scene, and you've got to know that last scene, or you don't know the show. So I think it's terrific now.
Now they have the time, you mean?
Yeah, there's no reason why they have to rush and get it in the next morning.
Absolutely
I never
right.
understood that.
And they go to a preview. It's up to a producer to say, don't come to the first preview. If it's been previewing for 2 weeks, allocate 2 days at the end of the 2 weeks, or something of that nature, whereby the play has had an opportunity to stretch, to get its bearings.
Yeah, that's one thing I hate about reviewing in Vegas is usually I've got to go to the opening night, and they have never had an audience, and sometimes the audience, as you know, greatly changes what you've got.
It's all friends.
But it's just the nature of the beast. I've got to get in there and do it, and usually the shows just run 2 weeks, so you don't have the time to.
Talking about Vegas, I don't want to really lean on it because we're talking about theater in general, but focusing in on that, what did you think? Without denigrating the taste of Mr. Wynn, what did you think of the choice of putting Avenue Q into a 1,200-seat venue at the Wynn Theater?
See, if it was successful, I'd be sitting here saying, "Oh, I knew it was going to be successful," and Mr. Wynn was brilliant. I really applauded him when he made that decision because what guts it took. What guts,
He loved it.
But he went against the odds. Everyone said Broadway doesn't work here. He got an exclusive contract that said Avenue Q would not tour.
I know.
And I was elated that he had the guts to do that.
But does it prove that Broadway doesn't work here?
I don't think it does at all. I think there were some mistakes with Avenue Q. I think it would be very successful in a small venue. That was in a huge theater.
Too big.
It's a very intimate show.
It's an intimate show. There were 6, 7 people in it.
Yeah, it's a very
with
intimate
puppets
show.
and everything. I didn't see it.
I knew when the number of tickets were being given away freely that it was in trouble. And that was
But Ken McCullum, the producer, is laughing because what he did is he told all the promoters on the road, "We can't play the road." And everybody screamed. What do you mean you can't play? We can't. He got a big check from Mr. Wynn, and now he's playing the road next season.
He's playing the road. But Forever Plaid is enormously successful here, but it's playing in a small lounge, and that's where I think Avenue Q belongs. So I regret that. I mean, I think the fact that what's going to happen is we're going to have another successful Broadway show, and then everybody's going to say Broadway works here. I think you have to be very careful when you take one show and you said, or 2 shows, or 3 shows. I mean, how many flops are there in New York? There's plenty of flops in New York. Vegas needs to have its flops. I don't think that means Broadway doesn't work here.
That's a very good point. It has to have its flops. Wynn is bringing Spamalot into
Spamalot and the producers.
Yeah, the producers is at the Paris,
I think in comparison, you mentioned New York. If you were working in New York, would you be critiquing differently? Or would it be the same type of criticism that you give here versus what you give in New York?
I would probably apply pretty close to the same standards that I do a touring show, meaning that most of the touring shows, not all of them, are equity, are union. You probably cut a little slack with set design. We were talking about Miss Saigon. In New York, you expect that helicopter to land. You expect it to be beautiful. And in a touring show, you cut it some slack. There's some practicality involved. But I would say it's pretty close. Is that what you mean by cutting some slack?
I'm trying to get a sense of when you're writing a critique, are you ever feeling that you have to hold back either because it is a university or a college production versus a touring production versus probably some people who don't have the budget or the personnel to do the show they've decided to do?
I don't think I hold back, but I think there's different standards. I know I've seen enough children's theater, amateur children's theater, where I believe there's good amateur children's theater and bad amateur children's theater. So I'm not holding back if I think it's bad amateur children's theater, but I'm not using the same standards that I do when I go to Broadway. When I go to the Nevada Conservatory Theater, I've seen good shows there and bad shows there, so I don't hold back if I don't like it. But without me even thinking about it, I'm applying a certain standard to them that I don't to let's say a children's theater.
And you've been doing this long enough that you have an idea of what kind of work particular directors are going to do. So if you know a director that has directed this particular show, do you go in expecting a certain level of quality?
Sometimes, I mean, you can't help it, you're human, but I've been surprised a lot. I'll give you a specific example. I used to never like the work of Michael Lugring at the Nevada Conservatory Theater, and I think in the last couple of years he has improved tremendously, and I've loved his shows. So it's very dangerous if you go in with too many expectations. And then you hear gossip, you hear that the show's in trouble or this or that. But I've been surprised enough. I've been surprised enough where I know not to take too seriously what I expect,
Is gossip ever a part of a critique? Things that you knew happened during the course of a rehearsal?
Sometimes it needs to be. Sometimes, like, you'll find the star died 2 days ago, and somebody took over the role. That happened with one. Well, they didn't die, but Bob Brewer in the Nevada Conservatory Theater took over a lead role in one of your shows
with the book.
Now, I think it's important that I knew why he was up there with the book.
Sure.
And
I made an announcement in front, if you remember.
Okay. But I knew all the details, and I'm glad I did.
But that helps. It was difficult.
But I think, the bottom line is you're reviewing what you're seeing in front of you. I'll give you an example. One time, I reviewed a show and I complained about the star's lack of energy. And I found out that that morning, that actress had had her first chemo session. Now, you know what? I'm glad I didn't know that. I'm glad I didn't know, because I'm a human being as well as a critic, you know, and I'm just glad that all I did was judge her performance. And, you know, I'm sorry she had chemo, but I mean, I don't regret the fact that I mentioned a lack of energy. As a human being, that would have been a very tough thing to write.
Did you get any feedback from anybody?
I got some calls, yeah,
I'm sure.
yeah, about what a rotten SOB I am and all that stuff.
You respond to the feedback you get from the writers?
If I feel like they want me to respond, you know, if they're talking about my mother, I usually leave it alone. But you know, so if they want an intelligent discussion, I love that, you know. But sometimes, some people just enjoy hating critics, and I let them enjoy that. They don't see me as a person, and they just want to get me. And they,
this is our attempt here to personalize you. That's the whole idea.
Yeah, but you see, as a producer, the terminology hating critics is a glittering generality that is horrendously unfair. And as a producer, I'll tell you right now, you know, I used, in our introduction, I used the words, they've been excoriated, they've been inundated, they've been applauded, et cetera, et cetera. Are they monsters or mentors? Well, sometimes they can be monsters, but a critic who understands how a play is structured, that's why I object to critics who don't know what's gone into it. I'm not talking about the money. I'm talking about the time, I'm talking about the care, I'm talking about the words, I'm talking about the view, the scenic design, etc. And then if you don't like it, fine, say you don't like it, because. But just to say, oh, it's a piece of garbage to use. I want to tell you, some of the British critics are supposed to be terrific, aren't. I've been there, I've done shows there. I mean, they use cheap phrases, I mean, it's become tawdry.
You find American critics versus European critics to be different?
Yeah, to some extent. I'm only really familiar with British critics as opposed to the others. I'm slightly, you know, vague on German critics and French critics.
West End versus Broadway, I guess.
Yeah, West End, Broadway, yeah. Well, West End, I think the critics are more immersed in the classics, in the structure, in the form. Not just Shakespeare, mind you, but I mean, even, you know, people who aren't British, Ibsen, et cetera, than the American critics. Yeah. But you talked about the writers. There's some wonderful writers. I think that Ben Brantley and Charles Isherwood of the New York Times are brilliant writers. I think that Frank Rich, who can write an excoriating negative review, is a brilliant writer who understands the theater.
My impression of British critics, going back some time, is that their attitude was that they were more a part of the process, whereas American critics love the idea of being detached from the theater community.
Very good
I don't know if that's still true, but I think at one time it was.
I think it's a very good point. Yeah. And maybe they're part of the process.
Explain what you mean by being a part of the process.
It's like theater is a collaboration, and the critics are part of the collaboration, collaborating to get the word out, to get people in the seats. They're part of the team. Even if they don't like something, they're part of the team. Whereas I think American critics, they're like the voice in the dark. They know nothing about who you are. They don't socialize with you. And they come in and they are on the reader's side, and they don't consider themselves part of the theater community.
So they understand that they do have the power then to close a show. And historically, some of them have taken advantage of that, it seems to me. You disagree?
You know, that's a loaded question. I'm not sure. I'm not sure they have power. I think they have influence, and any power they would have comes from the reader. You know, the reader. There are many critics that a reader will not listen to, and whatever. If they do listen to them, it's the reader who have given the critic that influence.
And from a producing end, you would feel the same way, that they don't have the power to.
They do have
those great shows. They do have power.
They do have power, but if you do a show that doesn't have a preconceived and preset reputation, a brand new show, and you don't have a big star, you have just some damn good actors and it's a good show, you better have a substantial monetary advance to protect yourself from the wrath of some critics. Because if they kill you and they get cruel and you don't have that money to advertise and last it out, you're going to close. You're in trouble.
And to me, that's power. To me, that's power in knowing that the critic can do that. And I guess I would find it surprising that a critic wouldn't know he or she has that kind of power and influence?
Well,
I'm playing with words here. I think there's a big difference between influence and power. The president has power. He can make a decision and get it done. A newspaper writer may have influence on the president, but he doesn't have the power to say this is the way it will be.
Okay.
and yet sometimes, and what about this? You get rave reviews for a show. Everybody likes it, all the critics, and the show can't make it.
Yeah.
And the show can't make it. They can't draw in the audience. Everybody said it's wonderful, it's terrific, it's funny, it's exciting, go to the theater, etc. And they limp along, and they don't make the break, and they don't make the money, and eventually, despite the great reviews, don't ask me to tell you which, but you know that there are shows like that that exist.
I'll give you a perfect example. I think if in Vegas, and this is probably true of most cities in the United States, if we had a brilliant 4-hour production of Long Day's Journey and Tonight, that's going to be a tough sell, no matter how brilliant it is.
Oh.
And one of the great things that I would love about my job is if it is brilliant, I get to say to the reader, hey, this is something you should take a look at, and here's why.
Or The Iceman Cometh.
Or The Iceman Cometh. And I just, I don't think about it. I know a lot of other people do, and if I was a producer, I would too. I don't think much about the relationship between the critic and the box office because that's none of my business as far as I'm concerned. That's not why I'm here. That's not what my job is. And I don't sit and analyze, do we have influence, do we not?
I think you're right. I think you're right. I think any producer that sits there, but when a show goes into rehearsal or while it's in the process, saying, wait a minute, we can't do this because the critics won't go for it, is making a big mistake.
Yeah,
what you have to do is you have to appeal to the broad spectrum of the audience. And you have to make sure, talking about the monetary sense, the business sense, you got enough money to promote, to market, to advertise, to sell.
And you got to know, do I want a big box office hit or do I want a good production? Because if you're going to do Long Day's Journey Tonight, that's going to be a hard sell. You do Grease 5, you're going to make millions.
And Long Day's Journey, in the right venue with the right actor and actress, and I call it actress, they still call it actor, can make money. You can do it in London at the National Theatre, which they've done. You can do it at the Old Vic, where they've done it, and you can do it on Broadway, where they've done it. With Brian Dennehy was in it. And,
but no one's advocating that would be the right show to do here in Las Vegas.
No.
Just don't think
I would, but
you get a
it's not
favorable
my
criticism.
money.
Yeah.
Can you see a show like that without an intermission?
Do you ever walk into any, let me say, for lack of a better term, hostile environments?
One time I walked into a theater, a small theater in the Round, and everybody booed as I took my
The
seat.
moment you walked in.
Really?
I would guess that's hostile environment. Yes, it happens a lot, and I've had people deny me
Tickets.
entrance with a letter from their attorney at the box office.
It happens.
Yeah, you got to
Consider
be.
yourself,
I don't know any
consider
critic.
yourself among the elite of the critics. It's happened to a lot of the big name critics in New York, where they've been blocked from going in, which is really silly, because they can get around it. Somebody else gets a ticket, they'll walk in.
And, it makes me wonder. I mean, as a producer, I'm not talking to you necessarily.
No.
When you ban me from the theater, are you demanding that I love your play? I mean, it's a very strange.
As I said, I don't
action.
know the answer to that. As I said a moment ago, I would never do it. Not because I'm afraid to do it, not because I can't have my arguments with critics, but to ban a critic, you're not doing anything for the show. So they'll send somebody else. And you've already engendered a certain kind of a negativity, a certain kind of a climate of aggressiveness.
Do you think that bad publicity is better than no publicity?
No.
No?
Not at all. I don't agree with that. I started in this business as a publicist for a long time, and I don't think bad publicity is better than no publicity. Well, and I want to kind of step to the side for a moment and say it depends on the kind of bad publicity. If you're talking about somebody's sexuality, for example, or somebody being raucous on stage, or being too sexy, or undressing, or something of that nature, if that can be qualified as bad publicity, it's a kind of publicity that's going to get the audience in. But if you get the bad publicity where it's just a bad show, and they just walk through it, and they do it repeatedly, that's not going to help the show.
If you had a choice between getting a bad review or getting no review, which would you prefer?
It depends on the bad review. And by that I mean very simply, if it's a bad review that talks about great acting in a terrible script, I'll take the bad review.
Okay.
If it talks about if you get a bad review where everybody's terrible, the acting is boring and terrible and slow and you'll go to sleep.
Don't
and the
go.
that kind of thing, then I'll take no review.
Okay.
It's a balance.
Now, I was comparing that with a show I did once, my first stint in professional theater, where I had the lead role, but I was only mentioned in one line. So in essence, it was a bad review because I wasn't being talked about, whereas had they talked more about my performance, I don't know, I guess it would have been a good review because at least I would have been mentioned. I don't know.
That brings up a good point, is that a lot of actors don't understand why they're not mentioned. And sometimes I will mention an actor, but an ad is brought in at the last minute, and without me even knowing it, they had to cut my article, and they have to pick, what am I going to cut? Well, he mentions 4 actors, we'll cut 2 of them.
Just like that, indiscriminately.
and
You
you
said we're
can't-
personalizing
that's right.
you, so you get a chance to explain those things.
Well,
and
but
then you have to
be careful not to think you know why you weren't mentioned. A lot of actors think it's because he didn't even notice me or whatever, and sometimes that's not true
Put
at all.
it up in the lead. They can't cut you from there, that's all. And on that note, I just want to thank you very, very much,
Thanks,
Tony
I
Del
enjoyed this,
Valle.
Mike. Thank you,
And
Nate.
we really enjoyed it. And
Thanks.
My
Nate
pleasure,
and I,
Tony.
Thanks.
I've enjoyed it.
thank you very
Thanks,
much for
Mike.
coming and giving us an insight into the life of a critic. And thank you all very much for watching, and we hope to return very shortly to let you know what it is producing for the theater does for all the audiences all over. Thank you.